The Southwest Missouri State University Department of Geography-Geology presents Land and Life in the Ozarks. This course is one of several units of study offered in Ozark Regional Studies at SMSU and is designed to enhance appreciation of the cultural heritage of this region.
This lecture will deal with the population characteristics of the Ozarks using primarily maps. And since I use a lot of maps in these presentations, and today I'm using a large number of maps, I have 10 maps stacked in 2 columns, 5 deep, I thought it might be a good time to read a little quotation I've been wanting to read for some time anyway. This has to do with the apparent instinctive liking for maps that geographers have, and it's taken from an article entitled The Education of a Geographer. It was written by Carl Ortwin Sauer. Sauer was a native of the Ozarks and became the Dean of American Cultural Geography. And I quote his remarks concerning geographers and their liking for maps. May a preselective bent toward geography be recognized before it asserts itself as a deliberate election. The first, let me say, most primitive and persistent trait is liking maps and thinking by means of them. We are empty-handed without them in the lecture room, in the study, in the field. Show me a geographer who does not need them constantly and want them about him, and I shall have my doubts as to whether he made the right choice of life. We squeeze our budgets to get more maps of all kinds. We collect them from filling stations and antique shops. We draw them, however badly, to illustrate our lectures and studies. Maps break down our inhibitions, stimulate our glands, stir our emotions, and loosen our tongues. Well, I have 10 maps that I'm going to use today, which hopefully will help me loosen my tongue with regard to population in the Ozarks. I'd like, first of all, to pick up where we left off in the last few lectures. We've been talking about the people who settled the Ozarks, the French, the American settlers on the eastern and northern borders, the German settlements, likewise the settlement of the interior, and the Indians who settled mainly in the Oklahoma Ozarks. We talked about where these people settled, and in the next 2 lectures I'll be talking about contemporary population. And I have prepared a graph which shows the growth of population since the census of 1850. And if we can turn to that graph, I think this might be a place for us to begin. First, just a word about the graph. This graph shows population growth from 1850 to 1970. And in compiling this information, we took the counties of the Ozarks, and the counties that lay on the borders of the Ozarks, I simply allocated a percentage of their population to the Ozarks. What we find here then is that in 1850, and by that date the Ozarks was settled approximately 2 people per square mile. As you can see, if we come in very tight with the camera here now, we can see that the population then was about 250,000, or about 250,000 people in the Ozarks in 1850. Then there was a growth of about 200,000 each 10 years, each 10-year period, up to 1890. At this time, we probably had what was the maximum density of population as far as farm population. And after that time, there was a redistribution of population, and in general, there was a leveling off of population growth. By 1890, there was an estimated 1,150,000 people in the Ozarks. Today, as you follow this graph across, in the 80 years since 1890, the growth has been fairly modest. In fact, there have been periods of time when there was decline. During the 1920s, there was a decline in population, then a fairly rapid growth during the 1930s, as there was a back-to-the-farm movement during the Depression years. Then practically no growth during the 40s, a decline during the 50s, and then during the census period 1960 to 1970, a rather rapid increase in population. The most recent estimates, the next census isn't until 1980, but the most recent estimates show that this graph, if we projected it to 1974, would turn up even faster, showing that the Ozarks is experiencing a very rapid increase in population compared to former times, that is in recent years, something more like the time before 1890. I'll be coming back to that later. Now, just a few figures or facts, I guess, as far as Ozark population is concerned. The total population I estimate at around 1.5 million. Now, this is a little bit, to put that in perspective, that's a little bit more than the Kansas City Standard Metropolitan Statistical Area. This is from the 97 counties that make up the Ozarks. Some of those counties don't lie entirely in the Ozarks. The average density, then, is about 38 persons per square mile. And this compares to the average density in the United States of approximately 60 people per square mile. The increase between 1960 and 1970 amounted to 192,000 people, which is, again, putting it in perspective, it's something like adding another Springfield and another Joplin to the region. That's approximately the combined population of those two cities. The percentage increase in the decade of the 1960s was 14%. Now, I'd like to turn to the maps, and we'll go through these maps, and I'll attempt to point out some of the characteristics of the population and distribution of the population of the Ozarks. So if we can turn to the first map, which simply shows population density in the United States, and I have outlined the Ozarks for assistance in interpreting the map. This, I've used a transparency to show the boundaries of the Ozarks, which you can see then the population patterns as compared to the remainder of the United States. What this shows is the areas in tan, which includes most of the counties of the Ozarks, have between 10 and 50 people per square mile, which the average density being 38, you might expect. There are some counties that have fewer than 10 people per square mile. For instance, Reynolds County, Shannon County, and Carter County in Missouri, Ozark County on the southern border of Missouri, and in this case it is Benton County in the, Newton County in the Boston Mountains of Arkansas. These are areas that are fairly isolated and remote. The counties that have densities in excess of 50 per square mile include Greene County. Greene County has an average density of 157 people per square mile. The other counties are, by and large, counties that have growth centers. For instance, Joplin. Here is Ottawa County in Oklahoma, which includes the town of Miami. Here's Pulaski County, which includes the concentration of population at Fort Leonard Wood. Cole County, which includes the capital at Jefferson City. And then Franklin County, which includes Washington, and quite a lot of dispersion of population from the St. Louis metropolitan area. Also Jefferson County, which is becoming heavily developed as far as residences of commuters going into St. Louis. Likewise, to a certain extent, St. Francis County, which shows over 50 people per square mile. And Cape Girardeau County in the southeastern Ozarks includes both Cape Girardeau and Jackson, which are fairly towns of fairly substantial size. Then, if I simply remove this map and let it drop down, we can look at some other characteristics of population. Earlier we talked about the Negroes being brought to the Ozarks primarily as slaves, and I showed you a map in the 1930s showing that there was a retreat of the Negro population from the Ozarks by 1930, and this retreat has gone on even farther. Today we see that this map shows the number of Negro persons in the United States in 1970, and the lowest category shown is in yellow, and you may not be able to pick this up very well, particularly if you're on a black and white set, but there are only 2 counties in the Ozarks that have more than 2,500 Negroes, and this is Pulaski County, which includes Fort Leonard Wood, And there are a number of Negroes, of course, in the military service. And Cole County, which includes the capital city of Missouri, and there are many, the Negroes find it easier to go into government employment where there's less discrimination. If we look at another map that shows somewhat the same thing, I thought this might be just a little bit more information on the black population of the Ozarks. This shows the percent of the total population. It's just a little different way of looking at it. We find that there is, the only county that shows up over 5% in the interior Ozarks is Pulaski County, again around which would include Fort Leonard Wood. There is a cluster in the old Boone's Lick country, which includes Cooper County and Cole County and Boone County, part of these counties in the Ozarks. And these counties have over 5% of their population that are Negroes. Butler County likewise shows up, but I suspect that most of these blacks are living actually outside the Ozarks, that is in the southeast alluvial lowlands where they are or have been used in the past in the commercial southern type agriculture that is found there. Okay, then if we can look at the next map, we see this map shows the number of American Indians in 1970. Many of these are descendants of the people who immigrated to the Ozarks over the Trail of Tears in the terrible winter of 1838 and 1839. If you look at the legend, if we can move the camera down to the legend, we see that this shows the only color that is shown in the Ozark region is this range 2,500 to 9,999. That's quite a range. We find that in the Ozarks, if we can go back up to the map here, in the western Ozarks, primarily the Oklahoma Ozarks, we do have Cherokee County, Adair County, Delaware County, and Muskogee County all have over 2,500 Indians. But in talking to knowledgeable people who know something about this area, the indication is that in these counties the Indian population is half or more. So we're probably talking about more in the order of 5,000 in each of these counties as far as the Indian population. Then in adjacent counties of Arkansas and Missouri and Kansas, we find over 100 Indians in these bordering counties. We also find over 100 Indians in Greene County and Pulaski County and Jefferson County, but this is a reflection of just the size of the population in those counties. The Indians comprise only a very, very small percent, probably less than 1%. If you look closely on your set, you'll see these counties are shaded in: Texas, Douglas, and Howell County. They're shown in yellow, may not show up too well, but this means that these counties have over 25 Indians, and this is really, I don't think this is any concentration of Indian population. It's more of a statistical thing. I suspect that the adjacent counties probably have some Indian population. These just happen to have 25, so that shows up as a modest concentration of Indian population. But it is, I think, what this map in summary shows is that there is still an important Indian element in the western Ozarks, primarily in the Oklahoma counties where the Cherokees settled. Okay, now if we can look at the next map then, we find here quite an interesting map, I think. It shows older Americans by counties in the United States in 1970. And by older Americans, this means people over 65 years of age. And if we can go down to the legend then, we see that the darkest color shows that 20% or more of the county's population is over 65. And the next color is 15 to 19%, and the next 10 to 15%. What we see is that the Ozarks, and for that matter, much of the Corn Belt and the Great Plains, has, by and large, older population than other sections of the United States. What this also means is that this region has been a major region of population export. I suspect that one of the most important exports that the Ozarks has had over the past 3/4 of a century is its young people. who have moved out to urban centers such as St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago, to the West Coast, and so on. There is one unusual county that shows up here, and this is Pulaski County, and I thought we ought to show that since less than 5, or point this out, since less than 5% of the population here is over 65. This is because the military population is counted, and of course this means that there's a large percentage of young people in a county where there is a large military installation. Okay, now if we can move over to the next map on the other side, we see another interesting characteristic of population. This is the percent of population that is urban. And if you read this title here, I suspect we really need to explain what we mean by urban population. The term urban really refers to a center of population over 2,500 people. And this is an arbitrary limit. This means that any town under 2,500 population is not urban, or it is classed as rural. A town over 2,500 is classed as urban, as an urban center. In looking at this map, if we can come in very tight on the legend, let's look at the legend first. We find here the dark purple is over 75% urban, 75 to 100% urban. The next category is 60 to 75% urban, 25 to 50% urban, and under 25%. This lightest color shows no urban population. And what we find, if we look at going back up to the map, and if we come in fairly tight here on the Ozark region, we find there are large areas in the Ozarks, clusters of counties, where there is no urban population. This means that there's no center with a population over 2,500. For instance, here in the Osage-Gasconade Hills, going back to our landform regions, also in the St. Francis Mountains and the Courtois Hills, several counties here with no urban population. In the White River country, a number of counties here with no urban population, and in the Boston Mountains likewise, no urban population. So we see then that the Ozarks really, a large part of the Ozarks at least, is a region of small towns and dispersed population. Only 2 counties in the Ozarks have over 75%, on this map at least, over 75% urban. Greene County is 100% urban because it is a standard metropolitan statistical area, and by definition it is all 100% urban population. This map is just a little out of date, but since the 1970 census, Christian County has been added. And as to show you how definitions can influence a map of this type, Christian County is shown here as being no urban population, and it's gone from no urban population to 100% urban population by simply the fact that it was added to the Springfield Standard Metropolitan Statistical Area. The other county that has over 75% urban population is Cape Girardeau County, which has both the city of Cape Girardeau and Jackson, which are fairly large towns. The other areas that have fairly substantial urban populations are centers that have, or counties that have gross centers, such as Phelps County with Rolla, Pulaski County with the Fort Leonard Wood installations and the communities around it, Jasper County, or Newton and Jasper County, which have Joplin, Ottawa County, and then in northwest Arkansas, the Fayetteville, Springdale cities, which make Washington County go up over 50% urban. Now, in the next map, if we take this one down, we see this is a very interesting map because it shows population trends. My little shield came off here. Let's see if I can stick it back on. It shows population trends between the period 1940 to 1970. And again, if we can go down to the legend, just to explain the legend a little bit, we see that all the areas in blue have gained population. The darkest blue in the last 3 census periods, the next in shading and two decades, or the two census periods, and the lightest blue only in the last census period. Likewise, the colors in red, various shades of red, are those that have lost population, and the darkest color means that they've lost population for the last 3 census periods. I think it's interesting to note that in the Ozarks, if we go back to the Ozark region and look at this closely, we see that 22 counties lost population, these areas in red, lost population during the 1960s, and 75 counties gained population. This means that there's more than 2/3 of the counties that have gained population, and this is a major reversal of a long-time trend of loss, at least in the outlying counties, or the more or less rural counties. Most of that population gain that we've seen on the map or the chart that I showed at the beginning that population gain was in the growth centers, certainly not in the outlying counties. But now we see a major reversal in that trend. And in fact, if we take the 1974 data, we find that even these counties that showed a loss on this map, all of them have made the reversal, and the whole region, all the counties in the Ozarks, are now showing growth. And this is a major turnaround as far as population is concerned. The growth rate, by and large, since 1970, from 1970 and 1974, is about 15%. And this is a very striking rate of growth. There are some counties, for instance, this county here, Ozark County, which showed loss of population for 3 decades, grew by 35% in a 4-year period. Now, this is a striking change in population, and certainly deserves attention. We'll come back to this and give you some explanations for these population trends in the next lecture. But certainly it was connected with the tourist recreation industry in that area, I am fairly sure. This next map shows the percent change in population. As you look at it, this map's tilted a little bit. Let's see if we can get it to sit up a little straighter. Again, I'd like to look at, this is in the period 1960 to 1970. Now if we can move down and take a look at that legend again, close up, we see that the areas in blue showed a gain in population, areas in red showed a loss in population. Over 10% if it's a dark red, under 10% if it is in the light or the pink color. Let's go back and take a look at the Ozarks then. And we find that most of the areas that did lose population in the census period of 1960 to 1970 lost by modest amounts, which is probably an indication that this turnaround was already underway in the late 1960s, that the population was beginning to show increase, and so they averaged out a little bit and received only a modest loss in population. These areas that did lose population tend to be remote areas by and large, or areas such as these counties on the western border that are associated with long-term areas of or long-term out-migration, particularly in northern Missouri and western Missouri, have always been, for the last 75 years, chronic areas of out-migration as farm consolidation has progressed. So we see then that the areas of rapid increase were, by and large, the urban centers again, and there seems to be some sort of a corridor of population growth along this transportation route between St. Louis into the northwest Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma. And that's an interesting thing that I want to come back and talk about a little bit later. Let's look at the next map then. This shows net migration. By and large, the population of a region is a reflection of its birth rate, its death rate, or mortality rate, and the number of people moving in or out of the region. And here we see that 2/3 of the counties in the Ozarks, these are the areas that are in blue, showed an increase in population. Fully 2/3 of the counties showed an increase in population due to net migration, as movement into these counties. So it's not just natural increase that's causing the population increases that we've seen in recent years. Again, the highest rates of net migration are in the urban centers, such as the overspill from St. Louis, Springfield, the Fayetteville area, the Rogers, Bentonville area in Benton County, and the Oklahoma counties, which are associated with tourism recreation, the tourism recreation counties along the Missouri-Arkansas border, and the recreation areas in the vicinity of Lake of the Ozarks. Here's Camden County showing more than a 10% over 20% in migration during that 10-year period. So the only other area of in-migration of consequence is the mining districts in Iron and Reynolds County. This is the new lead belt, and we'll be talking about that in a later lecture too. And finally then, if we can look at the last map, we see here quite an interesting map actually. It shows 1970 population as a percent of the maximum population ever attained in these counties. And I think this is really an interesting map because it puts all of this in perspective a little bit. What we find, if we can go down to the legend here then and explain it, is that the areas in blue, dark blue here, have 100% of their maximum population. This means that these counties have the highest population they ever have had. The area in light blue has 90% of its former population. In other words, all of the counties below the dark blue have less population than they had at one time in their history. The areas in green have between 75 and 90%. The area in the light green between 50 and 75% of their total maximum population. And the areas in yellow have less than 50% of their original, what they at one time had, and that was probably around 1890 or 1900. What we see then is that 24 counties have more population than they ever have had before, or about a fourth of the total counties in the Ozarks. And these tend to be, again, our urban centers such as Cole County, this corridor of counties from Franklin County down through Phelps and Pulaski County, Greene County, Jasper County, Benton and Washington County in Arkansas. That transportation corridor tends to show up as a region that has have always grown. They really show counties that have always grown in population by and large. We find 4 counties that have less than half their original population. This would be Newton and Madison counties in the Boston Mountains and Hickory and Dade County on the western Ozark border. These are areas that, particularly here, that have had long-term migration outward because of farm consolidation. We find that half of the counties then have less than 75% of their maximum population, and this is because formerly there were mining camps, lumber camps, and areas of, and there was at former times more farm population located in these counties. Well, this will then conclude the presentation for this time on the population of the Ozarks, the general characteristics and distribution of population. In the next lecture, I'll be talking about the rural to urban migration in some detail and the effects of this rural to urban migration on population patterns on the land. Has some very interesting research I think you'll find in the next lecture. And then we'll look at the population trends of some of the Ozarks' smaller towns.
For course information concerning land and life in the Ozarks, contact Dr. Milton Rafferty, Department Head, Geography Geology, Southwest Missouri State University, Springfield, Missouri, 65802.